We're going to have to start back over on this. So talking about value in a composition. So it can change the mood. It can increase clarity, and actually decrease legibility depending on how we handle value. So value is an element of design, and we can apply different techniques to the composition, like chiaroscuro, use value to suggest space, 2 dimensions, apply it as an element to create contrast, patterns, emphasis, focal point, and other principles. After this lesson, we will apply the steps of the design process to create original art that demonstrates the proper application of value. Through this lesson, we will also be able to explain why value is needed to create halftones for commercial art reproductions. These cartoons are always fun in this book. Value is the key determining factor that allows us to see contrast. Without value, changes within the design are difficult. It is not, if not impossible, to see. As we will learn throughout this lesson, value plays a role in how our art is perceived. We can use this to our benefit to create visual hierarchy and guide the viewer's eye from one design element to the next in a predetermined order. The way in which value is applied to design can increase or decrease our viewing experience. I don't want to say make it better or make it worse, because every design we make as an artist is done for a reason. We want to create a sense of confusion in a design or slow down the viewer's experience with our art. There are a number of reasons to employ air quotes, bad value. Are you able to see what the artist is presenting in the example on this side? Do you think that the artist has done this on purpose? This is an image of a polar bear in a snowstorm, after all. Where the artist has purposefully made the polar bear difficult to see, or if they simply missed the mark, we can agree that the variation in value between the polar bear and the white background is very low. It is so low, it makes it difficult to see the image. We must stop and focus on the image to be able to see its form. We are expected to make purposeful decisions about the art we create, including how value is applied to our design. So let's take a step back and define value so we can begin to explore how it can be applied in a variety of ways to a composition. Value is the measure of relative lightness and darkness within an image. We say relative lightness because value can be impacted by other factors within a composition like color. The example on the slide, you can see a wide range of variety of light and dark within the photograph. The artist was not only able to capture very dark shadows and very light highlights, but she was able to capture many different levels of value in between. Take a minute to really look at the image. How many different levels of gray can you see? When we talk about value, we often describe it in terms of grayscale. It's easier for us to understand that black is dark and white is light, and everything in between is a shade of gray. But value is not linked to any one color, not even gray. Value is the range of lightness and darkness within an image. However, we do need to consider color when working with value, because colors have an underlying inherent value that can be difficult for us to see when strictly looking at color. This means there is a relationship between color and value, but color and value are not the same thing. If you write one thing down during this lecture, it should be that color and value are not interchangeable terms. The relationship between value and color is illustrated on this slide. Each of the colors on the color wheel have been converted to grayscale to demonstrate their connection with value. Yellow is the lightest value color on the color wheel. You can see in the grayscale version that it's almost white. It is important to keep this in mind when adding color to design. When yellow is added, the design will have what is called high value color. Blue violet, on the other hand, is the darkest value color. So if we use it in a design, we are adding low value color. Color can play a huge factor when composing a design. If we look at the Matisse example on the slide, we see a grayscale and the color version. Artists often design in a grayscale to ensure the composition has balance, contrast, focal point, etc. There are a number of ways to ensure this, but one very common technique is to ensure value within the design. Then the design supports the principles of design. If we only look at the grayscale version of the painting, we may conclude that the painting lacks a clear focal point, balance, and contrast. But once color is added, we are able to see how the artist has embedded those principles of design. The color the artist chose mimic the values presented in the grayscale version, but allowed the design to pop. Value is the term we use to describe the lightness and the darkness within an image. When we use the term value contrast to talk about the relationship between the light areas and the dark areas of an image, it is a slight yet important distinction. We very rarely talk about value as a standalone concept. You'll never hear someone say, wow, the painting really has value. It definitely has lightness and darkness. Instead, we are comparing the existence of lightness and darkness in an image. We talk about how the lightness and darkness either work together or fight against one another. The value scale on the slide shows how lightness and darkness within an image can create contrast or lack of contrast. The examples on the far right and left sides have the most contrast. The background is 100% black or 10% black, while the middle circle is 50% neutral. The circles pop the background on both examples. As we work our way closer to the middle, the value scale is 50% neutral, circle pops less and less, becoming harder to see. It should be noted that there is no right or wrong answer here. The sharp contrast in the outer examples is not necessarily any more effective for your design than the lack of contrast in the middle square. What is important is that you make a decision about whether there should be sharp contrast between light and dark or not. As we explained in the last slide, the value contrast is the relationship between areas of light and dark within a composition. Our perception of value contrast is essential to seeing. High levels of contrast allow us to see a form more clearly, while low value makes it more difficult to interpret. There is a time and a place to employ both in the design. The examples on both sides illustrate both high and low contrast created as a result of the application of value. For example, the Golden Gate Bridge is easily identifiable in the high contrast areas and not so easily identifiable towards the top where the light sky and the light clouds lack a distinction in value. Value contrast can be applied to a design in many ways. We most often talk about it in terms of photography because photographers can do amazing things with the cameras to capture many different levels of value within an image. But value contrast is also a decision we make when creating artwork by hand or generating text in a digital software application. Examples A, B, and C on this slide show how easy it is to create low and high value contrast when adding words to a design. Are you wanting your audience to read the words quickly and easily? If so, you probably don't want to use low value contrast between the text and the background. That example is very difficult to read. The audience may skip over it entirely. Studies have shown that the average human eye can discern about 40 variations of value. Remember, that does not mean color. It means ranges of lightness and darkness. So while we can see that this image is composed of many different words because we can discern those words are made from different values. We cannot actually read any of them. The value contrast in the image is too low to make the words readable. In describing paintings, we often speak to their value pattern, which is another term we use to describe value in addition to value contrast. Value pattern is the arrangement and amount of variation in light and dark values independent of any colors used in the design. As a general rule, more value pattern within a composition is pleasing for our viewers. Value is an important way for artists to convey volume within a work of art. We use the term burrasco to describe the process. It is an Italian term that means use light and dark values to imply depth and volume in two-dimensional artwork. As you can see from the example on the slide, chiaroscuro has been used to create subtle value changes that allow the viewer to see a human form as opposed to a flat lines on a page. Chiaroscuro and shading are quite similar. The shading is a change in the value contrast which allows us at the viewer to see volume within the form. One of my favorite ways to manipulate value within design is to create a focal point through emphasis by planning high contrast in one area and subdued contrast elsewhere. An artist can ensure the viewer's eye will be directed towards a specific part of the design, aka the focal point. In the example on the slide, we are very quickly drawn across the design from left to right, stopping on the little girl blowing out the pinwheel. We visually stop there because of the high contrast between light and dark. There's an invisible wall that slams us in our tracks. The example on the last slide was very obvious. It was contrast between very light white and very dark black. But to create a focal point through the use of value does not require extremes between black and white. Remember, value contrast is the comparison of lights and darks in an image independent of color. So we can easily create a focal point using value within a colored image as we can in a black and white image. Leaping Trout by Winslow Homer has achieved this. The second you look at the painting, your eye is drawn to the area where the dark and the light values are in contrast. Here's another example of value being used as a primary element of design. In the example, contrast is created through the use of value. There's the obvious value contrast between the dark background on the right and the light background on the left. This pushes our eye to the subject in the middle of the composition, but even more so we engage with her because of the contrast applied to her form. We don't spend much time on her arm and shoulder because there is low contrast in that area. We do, however, find ourselves engaged in her hat and face where there is high contrast. By putting high value contrast in one area of an artwork and subdued contrast in other areas, the artist can capture a viewer's attention. This is illustrated in the example on the slide. We have no choice but to look immediately at the subject by the window. Putting more details in the composition through the application of value in areas of interest while making others harder to experience by using lower value contrast. We force the viewer to experience what we have predetermined to be the more important elements of the design. We are essentially creating a prescribed visual hierarchy, and the best is the viewer rarely even realizes we are forcing their hand. As a general rule, we like to have a wide range of values, and even within any given composition, however, that isn't a rule set in stone. There will be times when we will want to use images with lower value contrast. These images can either be very light or very dark, but for whatever reason, we want them included in our design. When we use an image where that range of values are mostly dark, it is called low key. When the range of values are mostly all light, it's called high key. The very first image we look at during the lesson was a polar bear in a snowstorm. That is an example of a high key image. Most, if not all, of the values within the image were very light. Again, low key and high key images do not need to necessarily be black and white. It is often easier to interpret the range of values used in a composition when the image is black and white. As you can see on both of these images, the black and white image on the left and the colored image on the right are great examples of low-key images. Most of the values used are dark. When you may have also started to notice that the low-key images tend to create a dark, sad, depressing feeling within the image. High-key images, in contrast, tend to feel more upbeat and happy. They feel brighter because they literally are brighter. They are composed mostly of light values. I'd also like you to know that just because an image is low-key or high-key doesn't mean every single value within the design must be dark or light. The high-key examples of the left is composed of almost entirely light values. The background is light, the cake sand is light, the cake itself is light, the icing on the cake is light, but there is a very dark, dense patch of blue violet flowers that run the middle of the cake. It is okay to have this dark value within the high-key image. It makes us engage with the image. It creates a pop of visual interest. If we think back to the polar bear and the snowstorm example from the beginning of the lecture, we can see a difference in the high-key nature of the image compared to this one. That one is boring because every single part of the image is low value. There's no distinction. There's no visual pop. There's nothing to keep our interest. Yet another use of value in design is to assist in the creation of the illusion of space. We can suggest space by using graduations of dark and light. This is the same as the technique we described for suggesting volume, but it also applies to suggesting space. In the example on the slide, we make the viewer sense space. The foreground objects are very dark and heavy, while the middle ground and background objects have less and less value contrast as they fall backwards into the painting. The background ends up being very light and out of focus, which makes us feel like there's a great expanse behind the darker, heavier foreground items. Atmospheric or aerial perspective occurs when far off objects within a compositional background less distinctive than their foreground counterparts. Objects in the background start to become absorbed into the atmosphere. Ansel Adams' photograph Yosemite Valley from Inspiration Point is a great example of this. The peaks closer to the camera are darker and more in focus, while the peaks in the far distance have a lower value contrast, become lighter, and are more out of focus. Characteristics of aerial perspective include the perception of less distinct value contrast on the objects as the objects recede into the distance. Colors wash out in the distance and become the color of the atmosphere and are less value contrast in the distance. In this entire lesson is focused on value. We discussed terms associated with the value, like value, contrast, and value pattern. We talked about how value can be used to create contrast, focal point, volume, and space within the design. We've emphasized that value and color are not interchangeable terms, but they do have a close relationship that should be explored. What we have failed to do is define value as shading or shading as value. Instead of thinking of value as the range of dark and light colors within the design, which now recognize as being a bad thing to do, we should recognize value as shading. When you hear someone talk about shading, I want you to substitute all of the things you know about value. We are using shading as one form of applying value to design. Any time shading is applied to our art, you're applying value. There are many ways to apply value to a composition. Shading, which generally is done with a smudging or blending process, is one method. The goal of applying value is to apply dark areas and light areas in the amount you determine are necessary to achieve those visual goals. How you choose to apply those dark and light areas is up to you. Cross-hatching is a second option for applying value. Lines of various densities are overlapped to create differing values. Cross-hatching is different from shading because lines are used, and in general, there is no graduation of color. The color applied is uniform, like black ink on white paper. The illusion of tonal ranges is achieved through the amount of the applied to a page. The more lines added, the darker the area will appear to be. If less lines are added, the area will appear to be lighter. Cross-hatching also comes in many forms. Lines can be applied consistently with care or rapidly in a haphazard way. Lines can be straight, wavy, or even curly. The lines should overlap in some way to create the cross-hatching effect. Doodling is similar to cross-hatching. Cross-hatching requires somewhat repetitive lines that overlap in some way. Doodles are more free form. Lines within a doodle do not necessarily need to overlap. However, they can still create the illusion of tonal ranges if more or less lines are applied. Wash drawing is a fourth technique for applying value to a composition. It occurs when ink or paint is diluted with water to create the desired shades of gray or other color that meet the artist's expectation for value within his or her composition. The example on the slide demonstrates the wash drawing technique. The value created by the wash area contrasts with the bright light values of the figures. The artist has darkened areas of the lesser importance to emphasize the main subjects of the painting. Stippling is a fifth technique for applying value to a composition. It allows artists to create visual grays within the design in a similar manner to cross-hatching. Gray does not actually exist. Stippling creates the illusion of gray. Dots of varied amounts and density are applied to create lighter and darker areas within the design, and more dots are applied with it. As more dots are applied, the area will appear darker. If less are applied, it will appear lighter. Creation of visual grays or tonal ranges in general is not strictly a fine art concept. When printing artwork, we use halftone dots to create the illusion of color out of necessity. We cannot print by hand or print using thousands of different colors. Instead, we must create the illusion of tone and the illusion of color through a limited palette. Instead of printing with blue, red, orange, pink, light pink, gray, dark gray, and green, we print using just 4 colors: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. When layers of transparent cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which are called CMYK for short, are printed one over the top of the next, then the colors blend together to create the illusion of all the colors in an image. Each one of these 4 colors also prints the illusion of tonal ranges within the color. Let's take black, for example. We cannot print gray. There's no way to dilute the black ink, so that when ink hits paper, it prints the color gray instead of black. Instead, we print the illusion of gray. When black halftone darts, like you see here in the visual example on the slide, are printed on white paper, our eye naturally blends the black halftone dots with a white background. If we put a lot of halftone dots together, there will be very little white paper showing through, so we will see a dark shade of gray or even black. However, if we leave a lot of white paper showing through, our eye will blend the black halftone dots with the white paper to create the illusion of gray. You can see it in action. You can see this in action when we zoom out on the larger image. When we can no longer see the individual halftone dots, our eye convinces us that we are looking at an image of a cat's eye instead of an image of a bunch of dots that kind of look like a cat's eye. We even think we see gray when we know there is no gray in the actual image. We've reached the end of our value lesson. After completing this lesson, you are now able to define value as an element of design, identify and apply techniques for creating value in a composition like chiaroscuro. Use value to suggest space in two-dimensional art. Apply value as an element of design to create contrast, pattern, emphasis in the focal point, and other principles of design. Apply the steps of the design process. Use the design process to create original art. Explain why value is needed to create halftones for commercial art reproductions. Thanks for joining.